How long does it take to be fluent? Well, it depends on several factors. But before I start discussing these factors, it's also important to note that what is the kind of fluency that you're trying to reach? Are you trying to be fluent in everyday settings about basic topics, or are you trying to get fluent in academic and business settings? So it really depends. So in this video, I'm gonna talk about 4 factors and how long you can reach fluency. Number 1, how similar your native language is to your target language. So if your first language is Indonesian and then you're trying to learn English, you're probably gonna take a lot longer than, let's say, a Dutch speaker trying to learn English. This is because Dutch and English come from the same language family, and there's just a lot more similarities between Dutch and English. But it's not the case with Indonesian and English. As an Indonesian native speaker trying to learn English, you're gonna have to spend a lot more time and effort trying to learn new concepts that do not exist in your native language. For instance, in English, there are concepts like the verb to be, or all of these different tenses, the past perfect, the present perfect. All of these concepts do not exist in Bahasa Indonesia. In Bahasa Indonesia, we simply have the past, present, and future, and that's it. So in my experience teaching people, I see that a lot of people have so much difficulties with tenses because the concepts are just very hard to grasp. But for people whose first language have all of these concepts, it's quite easy for them to grasp. Also, all of these different concepts make it that much harder for you to learn English with the translation method. Oftentimes, I always tell my Indonesian students not to translate word by word from Bahasa Indonesia to English or vice versa because the concepts just don't really translate. So for instance, if you're Italian trying to learn Spanish, using the translation method could actually be very effective because both Italian and Spanish come from the same language family and they're quite similar in terms of their grammar structure, their vocabulary, even their pronunciation. But for you Indonesians who are trying to learn English, the translation method is not very effective. Number 2, how much exposure do you get in your target language? I would say one of the most, if not the most important factor for you to get good in a language is to get as much exposure as you can. So think about how babies, children first learn their first language is through exposure from their caretakers, from their parents, from their environment. So getting as much exposure you have in the language is vital. But there's a common misconception. A lot of people think that living in a country where that target language is spoken is going to be like the magic pill for you to get fluent in that. That's not always necessary. You can give yourself a lot of exposure in the target language regardless of where you live in the world. Of course, getting exposed to the language without living in that country is a lot more challenging than, let's say, those people who live in the country, but it's still totally doable. You can do this by finding TV shows, movies, books, any form of content that you like, even music, and expose yourself to that as much as possible every single day. So this is a common theme in my channel. I've talked about this a million times before, but it's just so important that I cannot miss it in this video. Finding TV shows, movies, content, books, whatever you like is actually important, not to just give you exposure, but it's also a good way for you to keep yourself entertained and motivated when the learning process becomes a bit stale and boring. So if I get a little sick of speaking Dutch, of learning Dutch, what I can do is to just look on Netflix, find a TV show that I enjoy and just learn it from there and just watch it and just get exposed with that. However, just by getting exposed is not enough because, as a classic example, I live in the Netherlands and I have a lot of expat friends who have lived in the Netherlands for maybe almost a decade, but they still do not speak Dutch. This is because they don't really dedicate their time to actually study the language intentionally. Which brings me to the third point, which is how much deliberate study do you do in the target language? So from point 2, exposure itself is not enough because exposure is passive. This is the reason why a lot of my friends who are expat do not speak a word of Dutch because they're just getting exposed, but it's passive. Coupling your passive exposure in the target language with deliberate study of the language is a secret recipe to reach fluency faster. Because just getting exposed to the language without studying is quite passive, it's gonna take you a long time to reach fluency if you solely depend on this method. On the other hand, literally, just studying the language deliberately, intentionally, gets a little boring, and this is what adults usually do in language classes, because when we learn languages in a language class, that is purely intentional, deliberate studying. The problem with just relying solely on this deliberate study is that it gets boring quite quickly. How many of you actually enjoyed English classes when you were in high school? So each method has its pros and cons. Getting exposed to the language is more fun, it's effortless, but it's passive. That's why it takes a long time for you to get good. Deliberate study by itself, it's active, it's intentional, and if you really do it well, you can really speed up your way to fluency, but it gets boring quite quickly. And in my experience, deliberate study of the language rarely produce fluent speakers because I don't know why. There are a lot of reasons why. Which brings me to the fourth point, which is how effective is your study method? If you find yourself consistently studying, consistently exposing yourself, but you feel like you're not really making any progress in your language learning journey, that means you're not using an effective method. A bad method slows down your progress, or even worse, keeps you stuck in your current level. A good method speeds up your progress, and I've mentioned earlier that a good method that you need to adopt for yourself is to combine both the passive exposure and the active studying together. That's a secret recipe that makes a good method. Because just like every other things in life, you need to have a balance. Because too much of one thing is not good, so you just have to know to balance it out. But why do you need both passive exposure and deliberate study? Because the passive exposure keeps things fun and the deliberate study keeps things serious. And with these together, if you alternate between the fun and the serious, it's gonna keep you going. That's why in my premium program, English Sprint Academy, I teach exactly this. You will learn how to follow an effective method, keeping this balance tailored to your goals. You're gonna learn what kind of content that you actually need, because just consuming English with not the right content is just going to be counterproductive. So if you fit all of this criteria, then I encourage you to apply, because the next batch is going to open in August and the application is now open here. So if you guys are interested, I do encourage you to apply because this is going to help you a lot. And yeah, that is it for this video. I hope that this video helped you. As usual, if you like it, give it a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm, and I'll see you next week in another video. Until then, take care and goodbye.